to kick us off. Would you like to go on, Ella?
Thank you so much, Ben. So if you've got any technical issues during the session, we have got some tech support on hand. It's Alex, and he's helpfully named himself Tech Support. So if you do experience any issues, please do send him a message. Also, you will automatically receive notification noises when people put things in the chat or when people are joining and leaving the sessions, and you can turn them off because they are a little bit annoying. So in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen, if you press the little button that opens up the side panel, there's a settings tab, and you should be able to use that to turn off the notification noises. If you do have any questions, you won't be able to turn on your microphone or your camera, but you can pop them in the chat. So feel free to do that throughout the session. And when it comes to the open questions, I'll do my best to get through as many as possible. But first of all, I'm delighted to introduce our speakers for today's session. We've got Anita, Kevin, and Stephen joining us today. So I'll start off by introducing Kevin because I think Anita is still trying to get her camera working. So we'll start out with Kevin. So Kevin is the curator of the Botanic Garden and head of grounds at the University of Dundee. Kevin and I met last year on a very rainy day, a day a little bit like today, in the Spittal of Glenshee, and he took me on a tour of the Botanic Gardens, which is something I really recommend as a place to visit. Kevin's got a long background in rewilding and landscape stewardship, and more recently he's been undertaking his own research into 300 years of land use and land cover change in Angus, while enabling Rewilding Dundee to be formed, which is a project which enables multiple actors across the city of Dundee to engage citizens into something much bigger than themselves. Kevin, I've got some slides here for you, so if you want to turn on your microphone and say a little bit more about yourself, that would be great.
Excellent, thank you, Ella. First of all, if I say, as a practitioner rather than academic working in this space, I mean, I explore sustainable land use on sites that I manage or have influenced over multiple years, and my interest in rewilding have really been fostered from those experiences, lived experiences over multiple spaces. Within an initial background, if you go to the next slide, Ella, I'll try, but let's see if I can do it. Yes, great. Okay, so I can do it. With an initial background in environmental horticulture and applied plant biology, my introduction to ecology and environment was very much in the tradition of Frederick Clement's theory of vegetation change to climax community. While early introductions to systems thinking and earth sciences led me to question the accepted wisdom that informed the distribution and diversity within the perceived natural world and the places I was working. As a student at Cambridge Botanic Gardens, for instance, I benefited from a Merlin studentship to study ecological landscapes in Germany, exploring phytosociological living collections, urban and nature conservation landscapes. And through those, I was introduced to people like James Hitchmoff, who's a professor of landscape architecture at Sheffield, or Tony Kendall, who's been involved in the Eden Project, and Peter Thurday. Their work at Sheffield, Liverpool and Bath, and also my own experiences being on the ground made me question some of that climax ecology that I was formerly trained in. And then sometime later, after specialising in trees, I ended up working at Windsor Great Park. And Windsor Great Park, my role there was to look after and steward trees up to 1100 years old in the landscape. It led me to explore through my own learning, conservation management and science at Surrey University, but more importantly, it introduced me to the world of wood pasture. And working with people like Ted Green and Bill Cathcart, the Ancient Tree Forum took me across Europe and meeting Franz Vera, who I was lucky enough to bring back to the UK for his first ever talk on this side of the shore at the Arboricultural Association, a meeting which was really controversial, I must say, and still continues to divide people in the way they think about it. But at Windsor, we established some really important principles back then. This is back in 2002. 2000, I first started working there, and we began working on enlarging our triple SI and looking to establish SAC and SPA protected protected area status. And what we managed to do was move away from a conservation based on species and habitats to a dynamic living system, with the landscape being recognised as being driven by herbivores. That work took me then through experiences of using bats at the landscape level to work with ecologists at ZSL in zoos, and then later on to work at places like the National Trust for Scotland as a land manager, where I was able to integrate some of that thinking. Indeed, I think Jonathan Carruthers-Jones was a PhD student then of Steve's, and he came to exhibit, help us explore concepts of wilderness there. In fact, helping me understand that the wildest place up there was actually the coastline, not the inland wilderness as it was stated on the map. So coming back to Dundee, what am I trying to do there? Well, we're not really rewilding our cities. We're probably renaturing, if anything. But what the main part of the work is actually about people. It's about helping people understand how we live unsustainably in the world at the moment, and how we might be able to move towards a sustainable future and giving hope. Thank you, Anna.
Thank you so much, Kevin. The next speaker I'd like to introduce is Steve Carver. Let me just go back to our speakers page. So Steve is a senior lecturer in geography at the University of Leeds and the director of Wildland Research Institute and the co-chair of the IUCN CEM Rewilding Task Force, which is a bit of a mouthful. Steve has done mapping of wild places across the world, including the USA, China, Scotland, France, and most recently has been helping Iceland map their wilderness areas in the Central Highlands. Steve, do you want to say a little bit more about yourself and why you're interested in rewilding?
Yeah, sure, thanks. I got dragged into the rewilding scene many years ago because I ran an ESRC seminar series from Leeds back in the late 90s, actually, where we started actually talking about this thing rewilding at the time. So, we go back a long time on that. And from then I've, basically built up a small team where we specialize in providing spatial solutions, whatever you want to call them, maps of wild places. And in mapping wilderness attributes, you can also map areas where there are potential to move landscapes a little bit further to the right along a sort of a continuum of human modification of landscapes. If you imagine a continuum from left being highly modified landscapes, urban areas, and at the right end of the spectrum you have wilderness areas. And if we're to address some of the ongoing issues about climate and biodiversity loss, then we need to take selected landscapes further towards that wilderness end of the spectrum. It's actually interesting that Kevin just mentioned Windsor Great Park, and Jonathan Carruthers-Jones, because I do a lot of work with Jonathan. We're good friends and colleagues, and we're currently working on a rewilding potential map for the whole of the UK, based around ecological integrity and ecological connectivity potential, flow potential for species in the landscape. And Rewilding Britain are using that to inform their strategic thinking on where to target areas for rewilding. And we're going to do we've developed the map as a first draft, and we want to do some case studies validation on that. And we've just been talking to the Crown Estates, as it happens. I'm not allowed to say this, but anyway, it's cat's out of the bag now. And Windsor Great Park is potentially one of our case study areas for some ground truthing and validation and calibration of the model. So, yeah, we'll come back to wood pasture and Franz Vera, I'm sure, but I have some strong opinions about that. Oh yes, and it is a mouthful, the IUCN. It's now the Rewilding Thematic Group, we've graduated. We're a permanent fixture now in the IUCN. Cheers, everyone.
Brilliant, thanks, Steve. And it sounds like some really interesting conversations to come back to there. So the final speaker I'd like to introduce you to is Anita Collins, who I'm hoping we'll be able to at least hear in a moment. So Anita has recently become the guardian of 8 acres of grasslands, which she's been rewilding. And already she started to see curlews and red kites nesting in the area. And now she's trying to plan interventions to introduce more biodiversity to this land. So Anita, do you want to say a little bit more? I can share your slides for you.
Yes. Okay, that's brilliant. Thanks, Ella. Yes, you can see and hear me, I think, now, which is brilliant. I think it was just a matter of, I was on the wrong browser. The browser didn't like us. So thanks very much for your help with that. So great stuff. So I've just put a few slides to really get your sense of where we are and what it's like. And we've only been here, as you can see, just over a year. So we arrived in February 2021. And it's now May 2022. That is the first picture I probably took of the back of where we live. So I'll try and kind of orientate you in terms of the land. You can see a farmhouse into the distance. All of that is not ours. We're in the far right bit. So we live here, and we bought the house with the land, and I'm not sure whether we bought the land with the house or the house with the land. It all sort of came together, and I'm not quite sure how we got here, but we did. I'd been interested in buying some land, just a small amount of land, because I lived in the city. I lived in North Leeds in a semi, so I moved from a semi in North Leeds to this about just over a year ago. Next slide, please, Ella. So just to give you a sense of the surroundings, so that was, you just saw it from the back basically, and now you can see it from above. So you can see where the blue is. We're basically on something called the Chevin, which is, now the geographers will be able to give me a lot more detail about this. I have done a bit of reading about the geology here, but we're basically on a kind of an outcrop above the town of Otley, which is in West Yorkshire, Wharfdale, Lower Wharfdale. It's about, well, it's exactly 30 minutes from the University of Leeds, because I commute there, and it's not remote, as you can see. 20 minutes walk or 5 minutes drive from a town, the town of Otley, and over the other side, what you can't see is also Leeds Bradford Airport is just to the south of the picture, and also a big suburb of Leeds called Guiseley, Yeadon, Rawdon. So we're in the countries, but we are by no means remote. Okay, next please. Okay, so again, to give you a bit more of a sense of orientation, I took a picture last summer from the bridge in the middle of Otley, the town of Otley. That is the River Wharf that you can see, someone having a nice bit of pleasure boating there. And what you can see above you, the rise in the land there, that is what we call Otley Chevin, and the patch of green meadow, that's where we are. So basically we are surrounded by Otley Forest Park, the Chevin Forest Park, and we are in a sense a cleared area, surrounded to the south by lots of farmland, but as you can see to the other sort of orientations, we've got the forest park and further wooded areas. Okay, next one, Ella, thanks. So again, a bit of a sense of where we are. This is a tool that I got to use when I was trying to work out exactly how much land we had. I'll talk to you a little bit in a minute about what we were doing when we were putting in a bid for trees. We've just got under 8 acres, which is just over 3 hectares. So that's the set. And again, you can see to the left of this picture, we've got a kind of, it's almost like you might call it a trailer park, but it's kind of staticky homes there. So there's a community, again, about a couple of minutes walk from our door. Okay. So first impressions. This is one of the first pictures that I took. This was a very snowy February 2021. Don't know if you remember, last February was like Arctic for about 2 weeks. Those are the 2 weeks we moved in with no heating. So that was interesting for the start. So there was snow on the ground, and it all looked a bit kind of sad and neglected. There had been somebody living on site, but there hadn't been anybody living in our house or really working, doing anything much with the land for for probably a good 18 months, which from a rewilding point of view is not a bad thing, but it's why it looked like it did. Okay, Ella, next one. Again, just a bit more of a sense of, this is looking south from the farmhouse back up to where that picture that you first saw is at the top of the hill. So basically our land is a triangle. It goes up to a tip. Basically, what you're seeing there are our sort of front fields. We have 3 fields at the front. Lots of nice Yorkshire stone walls, you can see. Okay, next one, Ella. And this is the back when we arrived. So we have a lovely view, as you can see, back over Otley. That's looking back down over the town. Very steep drop off there. We're pretty much just on a rock plinth. So what we found when we arrived here very quickly was that although we had a lot, what seemed like a lot of land to us coming from a Meanwood, Semi and North Leeds, actually we don't have very much soil. So that's been something we've had to start to think about if we are trying to think about planting anything up. And you can see the rather lovely yew bush that previous people have stuck in the middle. So it's a slightly odd combination sometimes of kind of fields and sort of slightly gardening. Okay, Ella, next one. And again, this is one of the first pictures I took of the house from that north-facing field. You can see the house covered in ivy. It's all a bit sort of Great Expectations-y there. And, you know, nothing had been happening in these fields for a good couple of years, maybe the odd horse in there grazing, but not very much. So you can see it's already quite kind of overgrown, quite a lot of thorny, shrubby areas. You know, the grass is long and it's such a steep slope, it's incredibly steep. So, you know, you can't mow it, not even if you wanted to. Okay, next one, Ella. Okay, so interventions. We have kind of been making it up as we go along. We're very lucky to have a close friend who is an ecologist, and in fact he has an ecology practice down in Otley. So quite early on, in fact about this time, he came and walked the fields with us for a few hours one day, and we've pretty much followed his advice. So it'd be interesting to see what other people think about what we've been doing. We've planted up really the only main intervention we've done so far is a bit of mowing and a bit of planting hedgerows. So we planted some hedgerows alongside our neighbour's barn, mainly hawthorn with some field maple, wild pear, dog rose, and whatever else I could get my hands on. It was like an end of season sale, so I bought quite a lot of kind of whips and stuck them in the ground, and they've mainly taken. So actually, I think I can do it. I'm going to do it, Ella. That's fine. And that is my husband valiantly doing a little bit of mowing at that point. It was, as you know, you probably remember, it was a very wet May last year, and then a very warm June. And at the beginning of the very warm June, everything just went bananas. So there was suddenly all this stuff around. So he did a bit of strimming and a bit of mowing. We have one field that he mows. And then this is the kind of midpoint. So that was kind of near the beginning. Midpoint here, somebody came from the local village, a professional photographer, and took some pictures. So these look much better. So this is us again with in the background. This is how it looks like in January. Again, we've not really had any intervention on there, so it's quite scrubby grass, quite dry. There hasn't been much rain. And at this point, we had the arrival of sheep. In fact, they came in November. So our ecology friend advised us that if we wanted to kind of keep the grass as like meadows really, and I'd done enough reading to think that actually kind of trying to re-establish and to support the diversity of a wildflower meadow was something I'd like to try and do. He said, well, get some low grazing, you know, low intensity grazing going, and then maybe just do one hay cut. So we haven't done any hay cuts yet, but we've got some sheep. They're not ours. We found a lady who wanted some fields and we wanted some sheep, so that's pretty much it. Everything's done by barter now. A bit more of the sheep. We had some black Hebrideans in the back field that you can see them there in the snow, and then we've got a mixed flock of Jacobs and Poll Dorsets in the front fields. And we had more arrivals as well. So this is just a couple of orphaned lambs that we've had, and feeding time with the sheep. So yeah, they're quite greedy. So we spend quite a lot of time doing that now, and that's really our sheeping area. So future plans. Before, the farm was one whole, and it was basically used as a livery. So you might see in the in the middle ground there is a horse exerciser, actually, that is. And this next slide, oh no, not that one, this next one is what's called, well, I call it a menage, not everyone calls it that. So that's a horse exercise yard, basically. So we've inherited these things, not really sure what to do with them. But the thing that we found interesting, again, following our friend's advice, is that we've just kind of left it. We've had some sheep on just to help keep the grass down a little bit, just kind of so it doesn't go absolutely wild. And we have pretty much stood back, apart from that hedgerow, and just seen what's happening. And I don't know if you can see in the sort of middle right hand side, the bottom right hand corner of this menage area, that's where, when it does rain or when there's snow melt, it all comes down and collects in that corner. So rather than fight it, you know, and start to sort of we've decided, okay, that's going to be like a little wetland area, or at least that's what we're thinking of it. So we're trying to sort of see what happens. It does get quite boggy in some areas. So again, around the edges of this menage, it does get boggy. And so we're thinking of putting maybe some willows in and stuff like that. So that's the kind of extent of our thinking, but we've really not done very much so far. The only other thing that we've done is, this is my proposal that I put through to the Woodland Trust in their Moorwood scheme, which is basically, if you have to, it's a hectare is the minimum. So I put in a bid for a hectare of woodland, mixed woodland, and it's too small to see in here there, but that's their letter saying, yes, you can have some trees, we'll come and see you. So I'm waiting for them to come and see us and then advise us on where, and those are just the suggested areas that I've put in my proposal. And I think that's it. Sorry, I've taken up rather a lot of time. So there you are. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anita. I'm just going to stop sharing your slides. So thank you so much to all those speakers. It was really great to hear kind of about your work. So the way that this is going to work is we've got a few questions that we've written in advance. I'm really sorry that someone has just started digging up the road outside my window. So if I've got a lot of background noise, I apologise. So we'll start off asking the questions that we have before we open it up to the floor. So I will just share my screen to show you the first question. So the first question we have for the panel is, why should we rewild? So what are the benefits that wild spaces provide, especially when there is demand for land for other uses? And I think I'd like to refer to the question that Rachel has asked in the chat as well, about kind of the balance between needing land for wild spaces, but also the demand on land for things like food production, but also industry and housing as well. So perhaps I'll ask Anita first, maybe what your motivations were for rewilding, and then we can the other speakers can jump in and address some of those comments.
Thanks. Yeah, I think it was really a sense that I wasn't really sure, we weren't really sure what else to do. I think we kind of said that we were sort of the guardian of this land. You know, I was looking for maybe an acre or two and ended up with 8. So it's rather more than I thought I was going to be dealing with, and we live here as well. And I think as well, as soon as we kind of looked at the land at all, we realised that, you know, it's not agricultural land. You can't grow on it. We will, you know, we are planning to have, you know, a little vegetable garden, but really we're going to have to add the soil for that. And looking at what the environment was and how we could kind of enhance what's there, I think that was the thinking. I guess having the sheep on is kind of is a kind of compromise, in the sense that that would be, if you're going to do any sort of food production, that would be the sort of natural thing to do here. And the sheep seem very happy. Our sheep lady seems to think they're very happy here, and it suits them, this environment. And obviously, you know, I'm looking out my window now, and it's all green fields, you know, and hay meadows basically across Wharfdale. So you know, that's very much in keeping with where we are. But I'm totally, I mean, this is totally a new journey for me. You know, I've read Isabella Tree's Rewilding group book, and I've sort of been looking at things online, and you know, but that's really the extent of my knowledge. I'm not at all a professional. So like I said, took advice from our ecologist friend in doing that. And also because we, you know, I work full time at the university, and you know, we have busy lives, and so we didn't, you know, we aren't in a position to do a lot either, sort of time wise. So.
Thank you. I wonder if Steve or Kevin would like to address that question. So why would we want to rewild? What are the benefits, and what are perhaps the trade-offs with things like food systems?
I think we could take I mean, a lot of my work, to be honest, you know, is at much broader scale than what Anita's been talking about. You know, to address that particular question, then I think we need to sort of think about another continuum. And quite often people talk about land sharing versus land sparing. The sort of idea that you know, we might share our land with nature, and we do, of course, because we rely very much on nature for food production. But there are wilder ways of farming, and I think Anita's been talking about that, and I just heard the word NEP, which is a farm, let's not forget. And at the other end of the spectrum, we have land sparing, which says that we need to protect certain landscapes 100% for nature. But it's not an either or. You know, I think this is a continuum. So at one end of the spectrum, yes, we are sharing our landscapes with nature, and as I say, we do rely upon it for all sorts of things. You know, basic stuff. You know, photosynthesis as a natural process, hydrological cycle, the carbon cycle, nutrient cycles, all of those things. At the other end of the spectrum, as I say, I think, you know, there is a role for you know, rewilding in its strongest sense, which I have called in publications rewilding max. But in the middle somewhere, this high nature value farming, there are opportunities there, and I think NEP is a good example of what I then call rewilding light, in that it is still a farm, it is still producing food, it is still managed by Charlie and Izzy. It's not allowing nature to take entire control. There is a desired outcome there, which is, I'm sad to say, or whatever, is wood pasture. We could come back to that, but I did ask Charlie about how he decided, you know, what the trajectory was in between. Anyway, we'll come back to that. But yeah, I don't want to hog the table. Kevin.
No, thanks, Steve. It's really interesting hearing your link on that one between the conspectus different types. But what I'll try to do is pull on this. My example I'm going to use is Angus, and because it's on my doorstep, and coming here from west of Ross, very remote landscape with only 2,000 people in 70 miles, to a county with 170,000 people in one city and 170,000 in one of the largest counties. This really interesting space that I found myself in. It's a landscape that until recently, I mean 300 years ago, was a mosaic landscape full of biodiversity. I'm not saying it wasn't cleared, because it was one of the earliest cleared landscapes in Scotland. It was very fertile land, and the Romans were here cultivating crops over 2,000 years ago. So it gives you an idea. And in fact, trees were being imported into Angus over in 600 AD. So there was already a depauperation of trees in that landscape in the northeast coast of Scotland. But during the 17th and early 18th century, when 85% of people used to live on the land, we saw this displacement through an intensification of land use, but also a clearance of land cover. We saw that commodity crops began to be grown in landscapes that had been drained and were marled. We had whole lochs being drained and the marls taken out from the base of it. We had mechanical tillage being introduced, and latterly, since the Second World War, we've had inorganic inputs, and in fact, the soil in Angus is now toxic, as is all of the watercourses that feed in to the North Sea. So the outputs are unsustainable when considered against the inputs, and they are directed within a global food supply chain with major interests in grains, potatoes for animal feed, and alcohol, with high input in horticultural crops and fast food as outputs. It doesn't feed local people, This is a land which now is making profits for people who don't even live in the UK, but they use UK taxpayers' money. In fact, there's a barley hub with £70 million being spent on at the moment to intensify this further and make sure that it's more resilient with the climate change. So we undermine the local ecosystems, but there are pockets of regenerative agriculture in this landscape. And Ella will know from the work with the bioregion here, we're trying to look at how we can encourage joining up of those pockets where there is biodiversity within the landscape to make the landscape work better at a local level, to help the river courses be re-established with fish which come from the seas and make their way up the rivers which have been stopped because of the dams. So there's an awful lot of work to do in this landscape, and I guess it's a shift from shifting the focus from protecting biodiversity and endangered species through what we think of as stewards of landscapes, because they haven't been, to rebuilding ecosystem complexity through restoring guilds of functional species along with natural disturbance and connectivity, because that's what it's all about, really. It's potentially transformative, and it must be done, because if we don't do it now, it's going to be too late. And that's not me saying it, there's lots of people saying it.
I agree entirely.
Thank you so much, and that leads really nicely on to our next question, which you've all spoken about to some extent, which is, what is rewilding? So is it about completely letting go control, or is it something that we need to actively manage? So how do humans fit into it, and how hands-on is that management? And then a follow-up question to that would be, how can the public get involved in that? So I'm wondering, Steve, whether you want to go first on that question.
Okay. Yeah, I think you can. Yeah, they're all different flavors of rewilding, but you can basically split it down into two types if you want a basic categorization. And one of those is what we call active rewilding, and the other is passive rewilding or land abandonment. So active rewilding implies an element of human intervention in the process. And I don't think we can entirely separate out humans and nature in most landscapes, and certainly in our part of the world, because, as Kevin has just described, we've managed our landscapes for millennia, and will continue to do so. So active rewilding is about kind of getting in there and doing stuff, kind of thing that Anita's been doing. Passive rewilding, if we want to continue with Anita's piece of land, is she could just step back and do nothing and see what happens. I think there might be a predictable successional sequence there, and it probably, the grass would go all rank and things like that. But eventually they'd probably get some trees in there and it'd scrub up and what have you. But so those are the two kind of separate approaches. But yeah, it's much more complicated than that. So yeah, I will come back to NEP on this point, because I did ask Charlie at one point specifically. We were in Oxford, what was it, Cambridge together, and I said, Charlie, how do you decide how much meat to harvest from your land? The NEP rewilding estate. And he kind of thought for a minute. He goes, what do you mean? I said, well, if you don't harvest enough, the regenerative capacity of the trees and the scrub are going to outstrip the grazing pressure from the animals on the land. So if you harvest too much, you take too much meat off the land. So you're going to end up with a closed canopy woodland ultimately. If you don't harvest enough, you're going to end up with netvadersplassen. In other words, that's just a play on words to the transferus vadersplassen experiment. In the natural fecundity of the herd is going to grow and grow and grow and outstrip carrying capacity and outstrip the regenerative capacity of the trees and the scrubs, and you're going to end up with grassland. And he thought for a minute, he goes, I take enough off to get wood pasture. And I go, okay, that's active rewilding then. You've got a definite goal there, and you're intervening to get what Ted Green and Franz Vera have told him what he wants, which is wood pasture. And it's been great for biodiversity, don't get me wrong, but I wouldn't call it rewilding as such. It's an active intervention to get some desired outcome, which is a nice looking wood pasture landscape.
Go ahead, Kevin. You look like you're itching to jump in there.
Well, it's not. I mean, I agree. I mean, these things are complex, aren't they, in many respects? But at the academic level, the nuances matter, you know, and in the public aspect, it's much, it's hard for people to understand, but there are memes that people connect with, and they make sense, and they can work towards a zeitgeist where we all believe we're doing what we're doing. But I mean, for me, I don't know if anybody's read Paul Jepson and Kane Bly's book recently, but I quite like their concept of spaces of innovation, which look at this discussion going on in conservation philosophy and science and management, because we always, you know, we know from Thomas Kuhn that there's a paradigm shifts in thinking, and Vera in a way enabled that type of thinking, although he didn't necessarily get it quite right. But as he was coming from an inductive rather than deductive method, not as a scientist, but as an applied scientist, I think in that respect it was quite good. But I've learned over the years, maybe there's other ways of looking at this. So I take characterizing a desire to restore ecosystem processes at various scales is the important part here. Often through the introduction of functional species, which, you know, Anita's been looking at. There's things that are missing, and the ecologist is picking up on that. But probably more important later on, the restoration of natural disturbance and dispersal, and that includes water down that landscape. It's steep, land, and also air. The second part, though, is probably easier for me to answer, because I would say that in many ways the public are already involved. As Richard Dawkins highlights through his meme concept, the concept of rewilding is already being imitated and propagated in this cultural soup of human society. We can't control that, but we can influence it subtly, and I think this will help. This evening helps, and Steve's writing certainly helps in my understanding, just to sort of, you know, reflect on that side of it. And you know, in terms of we need to hold on to the academic language. There is a difference between Pleistocene, trophic, passive, and ecological rewilding. We need to understand that. And we need to ensure that we communicate that effectively between scientists and between those practitioners who aim to do that large scale work. And but I also believe that in the cultural soup of ideas, that it will be replicated, it will evolve, and whether it survives or becomes part of the zeitgeist or otherwise is forgotten in the meme pool of cultural language and ideas, well, that's for the people to decide, isn't it? The survival value of rewilding meme, if it has one in the wider cultural meme pool, results from its greater psychological appeal. For me, it provides hope to an otherwise deep and troubling question of our time that carries over from a dominant environmental and conservation meme, which in my lifetime shares doom and gloom. You know, my children despair. They don't want children. You know, 1/5 of all plants are threatened. There's climate extinctions, climate crisis, and unfortunately, I've propagated some of that in my own lifetime, and especially around population. You know, I despair that we're moving towards 10 billion people within their lifetime, not mine. And unsustainable land use really troubles me, especially when we all feed into that. You know, things that we don't need. Alcohol is a perfect example. It shouldn't be subsidized, doesn't need it, and yet somehow it gets the greatest share of the agricultural subsidy. There's something wrong there. So I would say that we need it to be propagated, but we also need to steer it. So I think there's something for the psychologist to chew over there, I guess.
Thank you. And Anita, did you have any reflections about kind of what your role is in rewilding?
Yeah, I mean, it's so tiny, isn't it, my space, even though it seemed massive when I arrived, and it does seem massive when we're trying to sort of, I don't know, get our heads around what to do. You know, it's tiny, obviously, but it's part of, and I suppose that's partly why I wanted to sort of show those aerial photographs and stuff like that. It's part of a much bigger ecosystem, which again, you know, will have evolved, and actually it's quite an post-industrial landscape here. I'm looking out over two lakes which were mining pits but now are lakes, you know, and we've got you can see that kind of industrial sort of landscape in the woods as well, and there's quite a lot of quarrying. or has been, and there's an active quarry just over the way. So I recognise I'm part in this sort of living, moving landscape as well. You know, these things are still happening, and I think also we have even in our small area, we've got a public footpath that goes through all of the land. So I feel, you know, people walk up from the town up to the top of the Shevin, and the Shevin and the town belong to the people in this community. So I think that also makes me feel very much that our space belongs to this community. You know, like I said, we're guardians in terms of the natural environment. So we think we have skylarks nesting in our top field, you know, and that's something that, you know, is sort of what, you know, wasn't the case. We've got fox cubs we've seen, so we think they're we've got a small spinney right at the bottom of the field that we just don't touch, and that's basically because we haven't had the chance to yet. But I don't think we're intending to, you know, as long as the trees don't fall on the road, because there is a road, we'll leave it be. And we've got a badger set in there, but without badgers, but we think the foxes are in there. So there's a number of different things, but I think we just kind of, I in a sense, the other thing to say, sorry, is that Steve was saying, you know, when we arrived, when we looked around and we looked carefully, you know, you just keep going back to, and looking at places again and again, we could see sycamores, we could see oaks, you know, growing. They have kind of sort of seeded, or they've generated from the landscape. We've not planted them, and so that is already happening. So without any intervention, yes, you know, top of the hill we'd have oaks, middle of the hill we'd have sycamores. You know, that is definitely happening.
Brilliant, thank you. So I'll just share our third question, which actually really speaks to the question that David has put in the chat as well, which is about how easy is it for general landowners to implement rewilding practices? And David has also asked kind of what public policy changes would be needed to do this. He's given the example of the challenges of offering payments for rewilding. So kind of what resources are needed, and how aware are people of these problems? So Kevin, I'm wondering whether you want to speak first on this to reflect on your work with Rewilding Dundee.
Yeah, happy to do that, Ella. I think for individual landowners, the first step's the hardest. You know, Anita's taken that first step, but it's not a simple A to B journey, as Steve was suggesting. You know, there's no plagio-climax linear model of succession or success at the end of it if you truly enter into a rewilding project. But it's a journey that you begin, and a process of becoming or enabling recovery, where people can come together and create spaces where new concepts and techniques can be tested and refined, because we're learning as we go along together. There's no handbook yet. It is something that is opening up. It's even challenging our own concepts of conservation. You know, things like niche. You know, is there really a niche or a habitat when you think of a dynamic landscape? Because nature doesn't know our cultural constructs or perceptions of landscape, or, as I was just saying, these ecological terms. But without cores that are biodiverse, we have nothing to connect to. So I suggest that the first consideration is the scale that you're working at, and whether you can actually either link to a core, buffer it, or create a core. And then from that, you can then look at the next scale of working in terms of connectivity as we go through. This is the way we're working in an urban setting in Dundee. Well, I'm working at two levels. Across the county, I'm formalising my work in a way that I can share, and I think I need to do a similar exercise that Jonathan did within Angus over the next 3 years of engaging in participatory research to get to understand why landowners are currently doing what they're doing, how it's come to be, and what the future vision could be of something that's a little bit more joined up and sustainable. At the same time, in Dundee itself, as an urban centre where most people live, and let's say most people are the ones that influence the political parties, and they're the ones with the money, then there we're working on nested cycle, where within the protection of the Dundee Botanic Gardens, I can actually evaluate ecosystem services and prototype models. We can nurture thinking, and we've got this living laboratory with 12 PhD students that are currently looking at nature connectivity through people. And then at the same time, across the sites I manage, which are 7 of them across the city, we can look at building these biodiverse spaces within the limits. I can't bring in carnivals, but we've got landscapes where we can provide the beginning of a process of change and take people with us on a journey, and then at the same time work across the city with partners, institutions, the city council itself, to create Dundee as a pilot city. And we've just put together a big Horizon 2020 bid to do that for the next 5 years, which I'm hoping in September we get that award, because that would be a wonderful project to allow us to look at this connectivity based on real data sets using satellite data and best knowledge and practice, which we then could inform and make a connectivity across the whole city, but take a population with us, because it has to involve people. So that's I'll leave it there, because that's the sort of way I'm thinking. I see myself as a partner where Steve at one end is leading a charge out there, making the case for landscape scale change, which we need to see. And while I'm subtly influencing people's thinking in the city, where policymakers are living and working, and sometimes disconnected from that wider world, but somehow trying to ground them without cutting off that link between the both of us, if that makes sense.
Thank you. Steve, did you want to follow up on that? So again, the question was about kind of how could average people do this, and then adding to what David said, like what policy interventions are needed.
It's difficult with an average person. You know, what is an average person? I mean, I'm not mowing my lawn. I haven't mowed it for quite a while because I'm a lazy sod. You know, somebody once said to me, you know, if I don't mow my lawn, is that rewilding? And I said, well, it has some biodiversity benefits because you're allowing the flowers to bloom, etc. And we can all do our little bit in our little bit in our gardens, I suppose. But then we can, you know, do things, you know, at a wider scale by joining appropriate organisations and putting our charitable donations here, there, and maybe volunteering for things. But also with our votes, you know, I could quote Elder Leopold Sound County Almanac here on his land ethic, which is my Twitter handle. But, you know, thinking about, you know, the broader policy scale things, rewilding won't happen without community support. And, you know, here, if we can imagine two triangles, you know, a top one inverted and a bottom one with its wide base at the bottom, a bit like an hourglass. And the top triangle represents government policy and fiscal mechanisms. You know, and if we can have, you know, those enlightened government policies with the financial support which comes with that, and maybe we'll see that through ELMS. I've yet to see that, but let's hope so. Filtering down to enable bottom-up community buy-in and support. So top down, bottom up, and where those two triangles overlap in the middle with a sort of a diamond shape, that's the sweet spot we want to be heading for. So you know, rewilding is not going to happen without local support. Now, whether that's a landowner like Anita, or, you know, Charlie and Izzy at a larger scale, or whether it's NGOs with large land holdings, it's not going to happen without, you know, local public support. And it's not just about the site itself, but then the land around it. So, you know, I think Kevin mentioned about, we can't, you know, consider carnivores because, you know, there are limits. I mean, ultimately, I think we are going to have to. You know, remember that Britain and Ireland are the only two major European countries without a breeding wolf population. You know, and that includes the Netherlands, it includes Belgium, it includes Luxembourg now. And so I guess we've got to question that in the longer term. But that then creates a barrier. It creates a cap, if you like, on that bottom triangle. In that a lot of, and I have these discussions regular way with people, you know, sheep farmers and the like, who, you know, the last thing they want to see is a large predator in the landscape that might predate on their flocks. You know, probably Anita, you're probably worried about in that respect as well. So I think, you know, we've got to consider it as this sort of top-down, bottom-up, and where the two overlap as a sweet spot that we need to try to, you know, pin down and identify. And hopefully we'll see that happen over the next few years.
Thank you. And so Anita, kind of, I guess the question would be, how easy was it for you to do this? Is the obvious question.
Yeah, thanks. I think, I just feel we've been incredibly lucky the whole journey. I think that it's been a good place to do it. People in Otley are quite clued in. So I literally was sitting having a meal and then met a friend who was with a friend who then knew a friend who had the sheep, and everything kind of seems to work in quite a kind of organic way. I happen to know this person, his friend is an ecologist. So it feels like there's been a lot of support. The woman who brought her sheep, turns out she's really interested in rewilding, has been to NEP, goes to different places, and she's kind of formulating her own thoughts about it. She doesn't have land, but she does have land. So she's rewilding up by Pateley Bridge, but thinking about how to do that there in a similar but wilder landscape in Nidderdale. And so I think it hasn't been that hard. There's been a lot of support, a lot of interest. I don't know whether I feel that, I'm lucky where I am, but maybe wherever you are, if you seek these things out, you'll find it. I joined the Yorkshire Rewilding Network, which is why I'm here, and Jessica is in this meeting as well, and she sort of organises that and is part of that process. So that's been going, I think, just for over a year. Jessica could pop something in the chat to just let us know about that as well. So I feel like I put out a few feelers, and really as soon as I found the Yorkshire Rewilding Network, because I was thinking, maybe we're thinking rewilding here, there was a whole load of things that sort of cascaded from that, and then it feels like the gods have been with us, I have to say. We've been here just over a year and we haven't done very much, but that's because we've intended not to do very much. And I feel like we've had a lot of support from all kinds of places and people. Just going back a little bit, like the lady who has our sheep, Sharon, who may be here as well, she works for an organisation called Open Country, which is thinking about involving communities in rewilding, which is an organisation which I think is based in Harrogate, and it's a charity which takes groups of people with learning difficulties and maybe recovering from mental health difficulties to work on rewilding projects. So I think all of these things have sort of come thick and fast, and this is with us having spent 3/4 of this time has been in lockdown. So I can't imagine what would have happened had we been sort of out there the whole time. So yeah, it's been incredible actually. And I've not had that much time to spend thinking about it and finding out about it, because we've had all kinds of things to do here. But yeah, so I'd say my experience is there's loads of interest, loads of support for us to sort of explore. And I do feel a bit nervous being in with such two obviously very, very experienced and sort of knowledgeable people. It feels uncomfortable, not in a bad way, but I'm very much coming from the sort of I'm a sort of somebody on the ground wondering what to do. But I've had a huge amount of support, so and support to actually just wait and watch. And I think that was it. Everybody's advice to start off with was just give it a year. But like I said, there was such an explosion of everything. Sort of June last year that we did a little bit of hacking through the undergrowth, but pretty much that and the hedge is all we've done. And the sheep.
Thank you so much. And that leads really nicely on to the next question, which is kind of about how do you ensure public support? And I think I'd like to return a little bit to what Steve was talking about as well, which is what are some of the challenges of that? And, if you're introducing carnivores and things like that, what are the ethics of it? So how do you ensure support, but also what are some of the ethical challenges and misgivings that people might have about rewilding? And Steve, do you want to jump in first?
Oh, okay. Context is really important. Depends where you are in the country. I noticed a question just whizzed past Jessica, I think it was Penrose, about Wales. Was it Wales? No, it's Alison Mayer asked a question about Wales. I was originally involved in the Summit to Sea project with Rewilding Britain, which was targeting an area of North Wales for a sort of rewilding flagship project. And the kickback that they got from the local farming community, Welsh-speaking hill farmers, was entirely predictable, and so predictable that even I saw it coming and said, "Whoa, I don't want anything to do with this." The idea of a bunch of English people coming in and telling a bunch of Welsh hill farmers what to do with their land, you can see where that one's going to go. And so, yeah, they did get a tremendous kickback, and Rewilding Britain had to pull out of the project, although the project is still kind of ongoing in some guise. And it's very similar in Scotland. There's all sorts of accusations flying about green lairds in Scotland now, so very rich people buying up Scottish sporting estates to rewild them. Anders Paulson, the Rousings, the Brewdog guys, and you get a lot of local kickback there because local people see this as outside money coming in. It's another clearances and all the rest of it. So you kind of really got to tread carefully on some of these issues, and particularly when you start talking about reintroducing large carnivores. And so the Cairngorm Connect project, they've recently done a public consultation exercise on lynx reintroduction in Scotland, and although the majority of people are in favour of it, local people and nationally, etc., because a few landowners and farmers are very much against it, they're backing off, and so at what point do you say, just because there's a few naysayers in the local community, does that stop you taking a much broader, national interest, national benefit type approach and say we're going to do it anyway? So these are really difficult questions. I'm glad I pulled out of the Summit to Sea project, early on, because as I say, it was just a bar brawl in many respects. With people putting signs up saying no to rewilding and along country lanes and things like that. So, and to some extent, the word itself, rewilding, winds people up. Because, well, for a whole bunch of reasons. Not least because people have spent many years, millennia, as Kevin was saying, making the land productive, and rewilding implies kind of stepping back from that and letting nature take its course. And yeah, these are really difficult questions, and you have to go kind of softly. And I put a link in the chat to our Rewilding Principles paper. And Principle 6 says, it actually underlines that, if you don't have the support of the local community, then it ain't going to happen. Simple as. And I guess there's another thing I just mentioned there. It's all about the land, wealth, and power nexus in many respects. If you've got land, a lot of land, then people are rich, and therefore they've got power and influence. So, and people like Anita doing their little bit, presumably not a rich person, like myself, come from a long line of slaves. We don't hold that kind of level of power. So I think it's also those people we have to target.
And Anita, have you found that anyone has been wound up by you using the term rewilding?
No, not in my experience, but I think because it's just, because I'm kind of not trying to go out there and persuade anybody else, and because the people I'm surrounded by there's somebody across the road who's basically a smallholder, and then, like I said, we've got sort of a caravan side one side. And then we've got the Chevin Forest Park on the other. There is one farmer at the back who will shout at us, but he would always shout at us, and so that's nothing to do with rewilding. So, that's just because that's how he engages with everyone. So that's fine. But actually, he's lovely, but he's very much a traditional farmer. And his fields look very lovely and green and juicy. So I don't know if I'll start looking really scruffy, whether he'll come and moan at us. But so far, no. and pretty much everyone who comes here is kind of interested or sort of engaging in some way. And like I said, we found all these kind of serendipitous things, like you know, the woman who's having, you know, grazing her sheep here, and it's very low intensity grazing, I guess I should say, and she herself is thinking about that as well. So, you know, she's always saying, well, let's move them around because I think there's too many on that field, and then let's move them to the back. And in fact, she's, you know, moves them over to the land she's got up in Paisley Bridge. So, you know, she's thinking about kind of making sure that it's what we'd call conservation grazing. But I'm feeling slightly embarrassed saying that because I don't really understand what conservation grazing is, but I know that that's kind of what we're trying to do. We're just trying to allow the land to kind of have a bit of space, not get completely overgrown with kind of trees, because the idea is to kind of encourage more of a like a hayfield, like a mixed kind of flower meadow type environment, rather than what Steve was describing earlier, which was to kind of let things happen and then we get, you know, my understanding is what Steve was saying, you know, a lot of scrub. We've already got little patches of scrub, you know, where we've got a lot of brambles, and then trees have grown up within them. So I can see these little microcosms, even on our small bit of land, of what that would look like, you know, and how that develops. It's very interesting. So yeah, I think no, it's been really positive. I'm sorry if that's not, you know, yeah, maybe that's just where we are. But I also think that what we're doing is so sort of low key and low key in all senses, that I don't think people are really going to notice. And if they do, it's because they're here as our guests and they're just happy to be here.
Well, that's very hopeful. As Kevin was saying, it's nice to hear some hopeful stories of it. Kevin, did you want to jump in to reflect on any kind of challenges or ethical dilemmas of rewilding?
Yeah, and I mean, I'm happy to sort of reflect on that. And I, again, just come back to these things about language. And I'm really interested in etymology, where words come from, how they get used and how they evolve. And I think rewilding is definitely a source of tension, of conflict, as Steve alluded to. It's which is a prerequisite to ethics in a way, where you have tension between different opposing views and searching for a new norm in our cultural value chain. But the areas of potential real conflict which have been raised are where there are ethical choices to make from rewilding. I think they've been summarized quite nicely by others, and I'll pull on people that I've read and am aware of and just direct you towards. So Kim Ward, who's a geographer at Plymouth, she's written in a recent British Ecological Society book on rewilding, highlighting some of the colonial links with just the word wilderness, which wilderness it carries baggage associated with a displacement of native Amerindians. And when we were establishing, or when the Western white incomers were establishing these concepts of areas without people, and that was a peopled landscape, and that baggage carries over. And she considers reframing that thinking in concepts of wildness rather than concepts of wilderness, because wildness takes us towards that regenerative, forward-looking vision of where we're going. I think that's helpful. James Hunter and Frank Fraser-Darling before him up in Scotland, as a human ecologist, drew attention to a similar displacement that Steve alluded to in terms of the highland clearances, which is still really raw in the northwest. And it's really funny is the wrong word, but interesting for me to see the difference between that in the highlands and in the lowlands, where the same displacement went on, but it's not, you know, it's not fresh. People aren't aware of it. There is a trace of that language that's still kept through in terms of the industrial songs and poetry which was sung in the jute factories, which I'm just uncovering within Dundee at the moment with some of the historical colleagues that I'm working with. But there is something around this concept of repeopling, which is also being introduced by James Hunter. And I think there is probably a synergy to make, that we can have wild landscapes with CORE's, the Biosphere Reserve, which I helped form up in Westeros. I was one of the original board members in terms of that. And I've just recently convened a meeting looking at this tension between the crofters and making a living on the margins, and this land ownership and land still economic displacement from that inland resource where their families came from, and how that might include people in the future and wildlife. And I think that's something to be played out. And I think we can't rely on ecotourism, I would say, which is being driven as the economic argument, because you can't just put houses up there. People have got to have something to do, and at the moment we haven't got the jobs up there. So it's a really interesting one. There is something around the Pleistocene epoch vision for these reserves up in the tundra and taiga, which are also quite challenging. They're interesting ecologically, but there is something about genetic engineering to recreate lost animals, which people will find difficult. You know, Dolly the sheep, I can remember that. You know, had people up in arms about that, but now we, you know, and we've moved. You know, Monsanto killed us looking at genetic engineering of crops just because of the way they pushed it through with soya. But there's still a big debate going on there of what we understand by science and what scientists are actually doing, as opposed to what people will willingly engage with. And I guess Steve's already talked about carnivore, so I won't go there. But there is a transparency, communication, engagement, and a slow process of change where we need to demonstrate and evidence the working in this new scientific discipline. And I think that requires resource. It should be funded centrally, and we should have opportunities to demonstrate that. And I do hope that government realizes that they need to intervene here and dream big. You know, they dreamt big over national parks, but they made them for people, not wildlife. And we've watched wildlife decline since the Second World War. So we need to rethink about these models, and if they truly are about wildlife and people, then let's make that happen and think differently. Let's get a new utopian vision to work towards. So I'll leave it there.
Please jump in, Steve.
Oh, right. Okay. Yeah, I didn't want to jump in with that. Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting things that Kevin's raised. You know, a couple of things. One is, I mean, wilderness, like rewilding, it's just a word. But yeah, it does come with some baggage. But I think, you know, we can't afford in this day and age of climate crisis and biodiversity loss and what have you to let a word and the baggage that comes with it tarnish everything else that's good about it. You know, so when I think about wilderness, I don't think about it necessarily in a cultural frame, but I think about it as you know, nature in the raw. You know, without I know, okay, there are very few areas of the world which are absent or nowhere where human impact is not noticeable in some form or other, if we include climate change and global pollution, etc. But there are places where humans have never had a foothold, or have only just arrived recently. You know, so I've been working in Iceland, looking at mapping wilderness for the Icelandic government and NGOs. Just recently submitted a report, started to be used, and you know, people have only been there for about 1,500 years. Same with New Zealand. So islands are actually interesting places to look at. So there, the prevailing ecosystems or the prevailing landscape is one of wildness, and it's only recently that humans have come along and changed that. So I don't think we can always take this anthropocentric viewpoint. You know, I think at some point we need to step back a little bit. If we think about Scotland, I did some mapping work for John Muir Trust a couple of years ago, where they were interested in this concept of the clearances as regards wildland in Scotland. And so what I did is I addressed this issue head on of you know, some people say it's not empty, it's emptied, you know, reference to the clearances. It's not a uniform picture. If we look at the data on from Ordnance Survey mapping, from archaeological evidence, not everywhere in the Highlands was populated. You know, particularly above the 300-meter contour, that land never really afforded people a living. Yes, it was known, people hunted there or whatever, but it was essentially wild. Norway has been wild. So, you know, the clearances were particularly vicious in some places, Sutherland and as an example, but in other places it was economic outmigration and not a uniform pattern. So I think we just need to be cognizant of that. And John Muir Trust are going down that route of repeopling, and I'm very much in favour of this idea that repeopling around the edge can support the preservation of, you know, biodiversity-rich wild landscapes in the core. So that, you know, Kevin mentioned biosphere reserves. That's very much the model of that. So I think that's a way forward. And whether if that's digital crofting rather than traditional crofting, then you know, all of this, the countryside skills of gillies and farmers, etc., being put to preserving biodiversity, great, bring it on.
Brilliant, thank you so much. That was a great discussion so far. We're now going to move on to having taken some questions from the audience. And while I kind of have a quick look through the chat, we've got a few questions which were submitted in advance. So the first one was from Mel Longdon at the City Council. And Mel asks, I want wildlife, what should I plant and what should I do? And she's got a semi-rural garden in an ex-mining area. So I wonder if any of the speakers would be able to maybe give an insight on where to start.
I'm happy to start that one if that helps, Ella.
That would be great. Thank you, Kevin.
Yeah, no, I mean, from building a bug hotel to creating a garden pond, there's lots of things you can do and make room for nature in your garden. And you can even do that on a windowsill, which is what I allude to with this work in Dundee. But Sheffield has a biodiversity action plan, so I'd say that do a little bit of desk work. You work in the city council, and in terms of that downtime in between the jobs you're doing, maybe you could just look and see which nearby nature you've got, because there needs to be some sort of connectivity. As Steve was saying, small spaces can make a difference, but only when they're added together. And I think that's the important thing. So you're lucky in Sheffield as well. The university over 10 years did a bugs project, biodiversity in urban gardens 1 and 2. And that highlights the significance that gardens have as an interconnected nature reserve. Indeed, ironically, through the gardens of the UK in their second one, they worked out that there is more interconnectivity and opportunity for insect support as nature reserves than we have in our prescribed designated nature reserves that are out there under statutory protection. So that shows you the value of that space. And the results of bugs projects confirm that they're a unique and important feature in the urban ecosystem. They could provide a resource that can be interconnected and then link back out into wilder landscapes that we can create through those nature corridors that our cities have been planned around, but not necessarily fostered, because the other important partner there is the city council itself, because we need to stop using pesticides. We need to think more ecologically about nature-based solutions being introduced in the way that we manage our green spaces. And we need to soften the hard architecture, green roofs, living walls, urban forests, and make space for that in the way that we work. And so that's a starting point for you.
Thank you so much, Kevin. Did anyone else want to add something to that question? If not, we can move on to the second question.
That was a great answer.
Yes, it was. So the next question we've got was submitted by Marie from Utrecht University, and that's referring to our controversial koi poo, which was the title photo for this event. And Marie asks, since the koi poo came to Britain 100 years ago, are they a threat to other parts of the ecosystem? And I'm hoping that Steve might have an answer to this, seeing as he was our resident koi poo identifier.
Well, I think we managed to get rid of them all, didn't we? I mean, they were in the creating havoc in the Norfolk Broads area, you know, where they were burrowing into banks and creating erosion problems and things like that. But I believe we have managed to eradicate them from the UK now, as far as I know. Maybe Kevin might know otherwise, or Anita, I don't know. But yes, I mean, invasive non-native species are a particular problem. It's not just koi poo, but And some of the Victorian conservationists were the worst offenders here. The 11th Earl of Bedford at Woburn Park, with his introduction of grey squirrels and muntjac and various other deer species, was one of the worst offenders. Yeah, we've got a country full of non-native invasive species, like many other places of the world. So yeah, it's an issue, but one which we've got to tackle. And whether that includes lethal control, and if you look at the work of Mark Beckhoff, then there's an argument that says that we should be using non-lethal control for ethical reasons. But at some point, I think you've just got to bite the bullet and get rid of them.
Cheers, Steve. Kevin, did you have anything to add to that one? Or Anita, I don't know
Well, I put in a post, actually. They were eradicated in 1989. It cost 2.5 million. There's a really nice blog which I just shared from Norfolk Biodiversity that charts the story of the koipu. And like Steve said, I mean, the centres of menageries and zoos have been a really interesting point of introduction of species that caused all sorts of problems. I can remember that from the work I had at ZSL, where their own reserve had let many of the deer out from there, and from Tring in the local landscapes of Bedfordshire. So there's an interesting study if anyone wanted to follow that one up.
Thank you, Kevin. I wonder, Anita, whether you want to speak on this third question, which is about how does grazing activity by cattle hinder rewilding processes in the UK? And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about your experience of sheep in that sense.
Yes, I can't tell you about cattle, but I can tell you about sheep. I can tell you a little bit about sheep. I mean, basically, when I found the Yorkshire Rewilding Group and I had a look at their recommended reading, I went off and I bought the Wilding by Isabella Tree, and I've been sort of reading that ever since and sort of thinking about it really, and various other things like just taking an interest and following up like links on the Rewilding Network site. So I really am. I keep on saying I'm an educationalist. I work in English language education and special educational needs. So this is not my area of study, even though I work at the University of Leeds. Steve does. I'm not in geography or ecology or anything like that. So I'm very much coming at it from a sort of a bottom up. I'm the bottom of your two triangles, Steve. So coming at it from that perspective. But we do have but I did get that sense of some grazing being helpful for certain sorts of rewilding projects, and then really it was like I keep saying, my friend the ecologist. Shall I give him a proper name check? So Gordon Haycock, he's got a ecology practice in Otley. I've known him since I was a student myself at Leeds. So he came round and when we were talking about, discussing kind of various options for things, he was like, we stood in those top fields and he said, well, if you wanted it to become sort of more like encourage the diversity of the meadow, you've already got some, quite a reasonable amount of diversity here. You can just encourage that by having some low-level grazing, or you could just leave it to go completely wild and you probably end up with an oak forest because there's all these little oak shoots coming out and little saplings. So that was kind of what he said, and we basically, I met him the other day, I've not seen him since, and he's like, how are you doing? And I was like, yep, taken all your advice basically. So that's my journey really. It was a combination of some readings and looking on the Rewilding website and then just meeting with a friend and him coming around and talking about options. But I feel slightly uncomfortable is probably too strong a word, but I'm unsure if that's the right thing to do. I don't know. I don't have strong views on it, but I think when I was looking, I read the sort of data, the quote of like 98% of wildflower meadows have been lost, since I think the last war, I can't even tell you. And I looked at that and I thought, maybe that's where I should help. If I'm going to help with anything, maybe that's what I should do. And so it's this real hodgepodge of sort of, I'm a real sort of patchwork collector of of kind of wisdom and people's ideas and a bit of reading. So that's really where I'm coming from. So obviously it's incredibly interesting and useful for me to be part of this. Although a lot of it feels like it's a little bit over my head. I know a lot of people who are attending today will know absolutely space more about this than me. So yeah, I'm all ears really. So I think it is. I mean, so going back to your question about the sheep have certainly made a difference on the landscape. And when I'm looking at some of those pictures that I've sort of collated from last year, the grass in the bottom field was much longer last year than it is now. They are keeping the grass at a shorter length. There's some poaching around where they go through the gates, and but having read again, the net book, poaching seems to be something that can be beneficial in terms of like encouraging diversity. So, but I'm absolutely, it's a total experiment. So I'm open for all offers basically. But I want to do the right thing, whatever that is. Like I do feel really strongly that we're kind of a custodian. Like I said, people from the local community use this space. They come through it. They're welcome here. People are welcome to use it. People who come here are welcome to be here and share in the environment. I feel it's a very wonderful thing to have such a kind of healing space. So, I do want to share it, but and do the right thing and encourage more diversity in terms of wildlife as well, which I kind of think we are seeing. But it's early days to really make any sort of judgment on that one.
Thanks, Anita. And I mean, that's my approach to getting knowledge for my PhD as well, is a bit of a bricolage of what I can learn from other people. Kevin or Steve, did either of you have any insights about either cattle or sheep and their role in rewilding?
Yeah, it's on the spectrum. And I think having a disturbance measure, process, influence in a landscape is important. But just be aware. I mean, on a patch of land the size of Anita's, you can easily manage a bit of light grazing, and then it'd be very valuable. It might possibly be interesting to get some pigs in there at some point. Maybe even some cattle. But just go steady with it. I do worry sometimes at a broader picture about the overemphasis on large herbivores in so-called rewilding projects. One of my colleagues refers to the conservation grazing scene as the herbivore mafia, and sees it as just a way of keeping a farming pressure on the land. And as I say, it's part of a continuum. And in some instances, I think that is it. I mean, take Ennerdale for example. I'm used to sit on the advisory panel for Wild Ennerdale, and I still work there. I cornered Gareth Browning once about the cattle in Ennerdale, and he'll quite often stand with his back against one of the exclosures in Ennerdale, which is sort of 10-15 foot high with scrub and saplings, etc., and outside of which it's almost completely bare, grazed to the quick by the cattle. And he'll say that cattle are necessary as a disturbance mechanism to open up the ground and the sward to allow tree regeneration. And I'm going, hang on a minute, what's happening behind you in this fenced off area? And then in private, it'll say, well, we've got to have cattle in the valley because we excluded all of the farming from the landscape. That would be a no-no in terms of community relations. I think it would have been better to put the cattle in at a later date to act as a disturbance measure once trees had got us re-established. And I think this is one of the issues which isn't really properly covered in Isabella Tree's book about NEP, is that the land they stopped farming on the land, then the scrub started to come back, then Franz Wehr and Ted Gein say, what you really need is some large herbivores in there. So that process of regeneration had already started. And I think that's the critical thing here, is you've got to get the habitat right first, before putting in reintroducing a grazing pressure, or ultimately at some point a carnivore pressure. So I think it's about sequence and process here.
Steve, adding to that as well, there's also I'll tell you a story about Franz Vera when he came to look at our 60 acres we were originally looking to introduce Chillingworth whites, the longhorn cattle to at Windsor. The question we had on our mind, that was Bill Cathcart and I as managers, was, okay, how many should we introduce? And he said, start with a small number, no more than 6, and grow it from there. Because what you're doing is you're watching for the impact. What we didn't want to do was stop the regeneration in those glades that we had open. We wanted to control bracken, but we also didn't want to browse too severely the ancient trees, which had been lapsed pollards and coppice. So there's again an element of subjectivity that hasn't. You're right to pick up in terms of it isn't in Isabella Tree's book, but they would have definitely been guided at the beginning by Franz and Ted by don't be over ambitious. And put too much in there. The other thing, my experience of working in zoos was that there are lots of different types of animals that graze and browse, and they're on a spectrum. They all act differently. Some will browse something. Let's look at a rhino, for instance, that could eat oaks, English oak, and it will turn their urine purple. That's not a bad thing, although vets will tell you it doesn't particularly look very good, because the actual gastric tannin, the tannins are really important to engage with the gastric process of digestion. But that knowledge has only been known because of animals in captivity, and we actually started a browse database when I was at ZSL, which is still there. It's available. It's a wiki-based browse database that catalogues all of the trees grown, trees, shrubs, grasses, grown within the landscapes of zoos and wildlife parks across Europe now, where we've been able to engage partners and have a look at the impacts on those animals that we were looking to do. Unfortunately, the conservationists don't know it's there. I tried sharing it with people who are interested in agroforestry, but I think there is a lot of knowledge we can learn about the impacts. And again, coming back to that, into thinking about Anita's patch, as someone who has managed paddocks in the past, if you only have one type of animal, you get one type of vegetation. And if you put too many animals on there, it ends up in a landscape which works towards a more open landscape rather than one with cover on it. So, mixing things up, not trying to do too much at the same time, not doing what, as I was taught when I studied conservation biology back in the 90s for the first time round. Don't try to create something of everything. If you look at your biodiversity action plan, look at the landscape, try to make connectivity with what's working at scale, rather than try to do a bit of everything. It will make you feel good. It'll make you give lots of stories, but it won't make a difference. And if you really want to make a difference, I think having a look over the garden fence outside your own wall is an important one where you can learn a lot from. That would be my thoughts.
Thank you so much. So I'll stop sharing these questions now and turn to the questions in the chat. So the first question that I can see comes from Martin, and Martin asks, bearing in mind that big companies are buying up big areas of land to rewild and to claim the resulting carbon sink credits, and he's put in brackets, we as a business are carbon negative because of the rewilding we've done. Is it helpful to the rewilding movement, or should we just nationalise large areas of land? That's a challenging question. I'm not sure who'd like to go first on that one.
Well, it's something that we've been struggling with. I sit on the Yorkshire Dales National Park Biodiversity Forum, and we recently had a presentation by an ecological company who's, I won't mention any names, but we were bamboozled by a proposal to put in place a sort of a rewilding credits kind of model, and it was, looking behind the gloss, it was all underpinned by the blockchain. And I asked the question in the meeting, I said, do you take into account the carbon footprint of the blockchain? Because this is massive computer calculations. The blockchain's annual electricity budget is bigger than Argentina's. And there was this sort of blank look. no. And I said, well, what's your cut? Well, we haven't worked that out yet. So I do worry about, you know, the natural capital model of, you know, carbon credits and biodiversity accounting. I kind of, yeah, I kind of see it's that kind of an approach is probably necessary because we live in a capitalist world, you know, where money does make the world go round. And so, you know, rewilding and biodiversity and creation, etc., probably need to buy into that model somehow. But I think it could be done in a more in a greener way. Let's put it that way.
Thank you. Did anyone else want to respond to that question? If not, we've got a couple of
I think
questions which
that's
I'll
beyond,
put together.
beyond my expertise level. Definitely out of my depth for that one.
Well, the next questions we've got are kind of about fencing. So Steve has asked, how do you manage deer? They seem to herbivore everything, and is fencing the only answer? And in a similar vein, Ben has asked, how do you stop wide-ranging animals from moving to rewilded spaces, to cropland, without restricting their natural instincts to have large ranges? So kind of questions about kind of how do we contain things, and kind of is fencing the only answer?
I'll start with that one because just to say that we do have deer coming into our back field, the very steep one, in the summer, and basically I think they are going from, again, if you look from above, you can see the Chevron Forest Park comes down, and then there's some woodland below, and I think we're just a break. So for them, we're just like a clearing in the woods, really, that they kind of come into and browse a little bit. So I don't think we have any reason to stop them. We love them. When they come, we get very excited, especially when they come with their you know, babies. And but yeah, so that's obviously not for a project like mine. But I suppose that going back to Kevin's thoughts earlier, I suppose my other thought, and this is something I'm going to talk to the Woodland Trust about when they come, is you know, if we're going to plant trees, should we be continuing that woodland? Because, you know, at the moment we have a gap, or is it actually beneficial to the wildlife to have this? Essentially, we're like a clearing for them between this big area of Forest Park and the sort of the forest. Then when I look out now across the valley, it's like little swathes of woodland between fields that are, you know, your traditional, what somebody called it, a green desert, you know, of kind of quite intensively farmed. We've got lots of sheep and some cattle, basically. So I think, yeah, the only fencing we've really had up is to stop our sheep from getting onto the road, for example, you know, for safety, and to sort of, yeah. So.
Thank you. Any more fence reflections?
Well, I just put a link in the chat to an article I wrote with Ian Cobbenbury for British Wildlife magazine last year called Rewilding: Time to Get Down Off the Fence. You know, in European landscapes, you know, particularly the more intensively managed landscapes, fences are important. Now, whether you're fencing in or fencing out is the key question here. Now, I could quote, or we do in the paper actually quote a famous poem by Robert Frost called Mending Wall, which has the line in it, "Good fences make good neighbours." And, you know, this is perhaps critical to how we can compartmentalise rewilding projects from productive landscapes in the UK and elsewhere in Europe. You know, so NEP, we talked about NEP earlier, you know, those areas there, it says free roaming large herbivores. They're not free roaming, they're fenced in because they don't want them wandering off and grazing their neighbours' fields. They don't want to lose them either, you know, because they're livestock at the end of the day. Do we fence out? to allow natural vegetation patterns to regenerate. So Scar Close in the Yorkshire Dales, a rewilding site that I visit regular way, has had livestock fenced out of that limestone pavement area for over 40 years. Inside the fence, it's amazing in terms of the biodiversity. There are 250 plus species of flowering plant. Outside of the fence, there's virtually none. In the next door nature reserve, where there's a conservation grazing regime, there's only about 50. What does that tell us? So are we fencing in or fencing out? Oostvaardersplaats, the infamous Frans Vera rewilding experiment in the Netherlands, where the fence creates a real problem for the large herbivores in there, because they've grown and grown through natural fecundity in terms of numbers, such that their population started to outstrip the carrying capacity of the land. And I've got a goldfinch in me, a goldcrest in the tree outside. Sorry, temporarily distracted. Such that there were winter die-offs. The animals started to starve because they couldn't migrate for fresh browse during the lean months. So there, the fence is the problem, not the solution. And so, you have to, if you're putting a fence around an area, you've got to manage. This is not North America. And there's a big difference between rewilding in North America, where it's the 3 Cs models of cores, corridors, and carnivores, and the model that we have here in Europe and the UK, Netherlands particularly, where rewilding sites are cheek by jowl against productive land. And, there the fence, the good fences make good neighbours.
Thank you so much. Chris has just popped a question in the chat, which I wonder if Kevin might want to speak to, which is about rewilded minds. And so how rewilded minds need to become before society can become comfortable with a truly wild environment. Are people generally too isolated physically and emotionally from natural processes and events to really appreciate what a fully functioning ecosystem would look like? I'll take that first question, and if we've got time, we'll come on to the end part. But yeah, I think Kevin might have a response.
Yeah, I got distracted by the word mines, thinking of Sheffield and mining. But I think you're talking about mines here, aren't you, in terms of the psychology of it? Yes. So can you just repeat the first part of that question again, and I'll come back. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's about kind of how your minds need to be rewilded before society can become comfortable with a truly wild environment.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the figures around shifting baseline syndrome in terms of each generation that passes, as we lose more elements in the wildlife around us, in terms of our everyday experience of that and engagement, we our normal thought process in our minds of what is biodiverse reduces. So over the last 100 years, for instance, we've seen a massive intensification and use of petrochemicals, especially after the Second World War, intensifying our land use, and the decline of not only biodiverse meadows, but also ponds, a million ponds, seasonal dry ditches, have changed landscapes, and people have accepted it in many ways, public this is, as something that's passive. They're green. There's a concept that Beth Ann Stagg, again from Southwest in Exeter University, calls green blindness, where people don't understand the world around them. And in fact, Edinburgh Botanic Gardens about 10 years ago did a national flora up here and worked out that most people only know 10 plants these days. 10 plants, and by know them, I mean not only know their name, but they know where they grow and they know how to use them. Whereas if you went back 150 years ago, there would be people in our communities that would know 300 plants, because we couldn't afford to go to a doctor. Only the landed gentry did that, and the history books tell you about those sort of people. The rest of us would have been engaged in our local environment. And I was lucky. I grew up on Dartmoor, and in many ways that experience has then informed my own perceptions of nature, natural, and the world around me. But I've still been challenged through my life in terms of understanding things, these little paradigm shifts of understanding, which come from being open in your own life journey to not know all the answers, but to be open, to be informed by others who maybe are exploring them differently. And most recently, I'll bring the concepts around education itself. There is a problem with our education system, which was developed in these structures where we teach disciplines remotely. We don't join up our thinking. We teach in silos. We learn too early on a reductive way of thinking about the world rather than holistic. And we really need to reframe education, if I'm honest. And we're all sitting from university backgrounds here, but actually, as I look, the institution I serve is the one that I hope one day changes radically away from where it is at the moment, because it isn't delivering people who are going to change the world in a rewilded way. It will actually just carry on turning out neoliberal people who want to make money, because we're taught that we need a castle and to live in, and rather than actually be a connected part of society together. So I would say Tim Ingold's, if you're interested in that sort of thinking, a social anthropologist who recently retired from Aberdeen, and he really questions a whole lot of that thread of interconnectivity between people and places, and how we take spaces and turn them into places through the actions and reactions of people and the environment, rather than the other way around. So radical, but hey.
Thank you, Kevin. And I wonder, Anita, whether you feel like your mind has been rewilded, or whether you feel like that's part of the process for you.
I've learnt about something I wouldn't have learnt about otherwise. It's totally transformed my life living here. Yeah, I'm deeply grateful, and it's like a very exciting journey. So yes. And I see that with people who come here. Like I said, Sharon brings groups of people, and she does that every day in various environments. But just people we know, or people who come here to do work or something like that. It's a very special thing. And this isn't a rewilded environment yet. It's just a natural environment, isn't it? So yeah, but for me, yeah, amazing.
Thank you very much. And Steve, I'll just turn to you for any final reflections before I close.
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm 56 now, and I've managed to get myself to all sorts of places through work. I don't have any land beyond the very small plot that my house sits on, but I do enjoy visiting dynamic landscapes which are, going through a process of change. And this is one of the problems with nature conservation in this country, which is, that in some respects the dead hand of conservation is about, this site has been designated for X species or this habitat, we've got to keep it like that. Rewilding isn't about that. Rewilding is about dynamism and succession to, different states. It's the nature of a lake to fill with sediment and become a reed bed, and that reed bed to dry out and become a bog, and the bog become a raised bog, and the raised bog become a heath, and the heath become a forest. It's succession, and seeing that succession happening in my short lifetime is fascinating. So I mentioned Scar Close, just simply putting a stop-proof fence around that, and I've been watching that for the last 20 odd years. Amazing place. Love to go there every year around about now for the maximum, the peak flower, and it's really interesting to see how those sites develop. Yeah, I don't think I'll ever own a patch of land, but of any significance. But yeah, so watching that inspires me.
Thank you so much. So we're coming to the end of our time. So I just want to give a massive thank you, firstly, to all the participants who've come along and for asking such great questions. I'm sure if you want to continue these conversations, I know that Steve, for example, is a prolific tweeter, but please do get in contact with us. Also, a huge thank you to Anita, Kevin and Steve, the speakers today. It's been such a great discussion, and I've learned a lot, and I hope that it's been enjoyable and informative for you as well. So I'm sure that everyone is kind of joining us in a very silent Blackboard round of applause. Just as a final plug, if you've enjoyed this conversation and you want more, you can't get enough of the Festival of Debate, there's an event tomorrow, which is called Growing for Invertebrates. And it's all about kind of how you can encourage biodiversity in your allotments or your veg patches or however you're growing food. And that's also being run by Grantham scholars. So we can pop a link to that in the chat. And there's another Grantham Centre online seminar coming up as well. And you can find out about those through the Grantham Scholar Eventbrite. But thank you so much for coming, and thanks again to the speakers. And we look forward to hearing from you all soon.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Bye. Thanks, Stella. And thanks, Ben. Thanks for everyone. Lovely to meet you, Steve, as well. And